72 hours ago, something happened in eastern Ukraine that made every Russian general in Moscow physically sick, and I need you to understand why before this information gets buried under the next news cycle. On January 22, 2026, at 3:47 in the morning KAV time, a classified briefing was delivered to NATO command. The content of that briefing is not public, but three separate defense analysts I spoke with off the record used the same phrase to describe it: checkmate diplomacy. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell, because what I am about to reveal will be deliberately obscured within 48 hours by people who do not want you connecting these dots. This is not about new weapons. This is not about another frontline breakthrough. This is about a strategic move so radical that it is forcing Russia to choose between two catastrophic options. And the fact that Vladimir Putin has not appeared in public for 6 days tells you everything about which option his generals are recommending. Stay with me. Here is what everyone expected Ukraine to do. Western analysts, Russian military planners, even most NATO strategists assumed Ukraine would continue the pattern we have seen for 3 years. Defend territory, wait for Western aid packages, negotiate from a position of weakness while hoping Russian economic collapse arrives before Ukrainian military exhaustion. That was the assumed playbook. Every think tank in Washington was modeling scenarios based on that framework. But on January 20th, Ukraine did something nobody predicted. Not a massive military offensive, not a desperate territorial push, not another appeal to Western governments for more sophisticated weapons. What Ukraine announced was the creation of what they called a special economic zone along the Belarus border. And if that sounds boring, if that sounds like bureaucratic procedure that belongs on page 14 of the Financial Times, then you are missing what just happened. Because that economic zone is not about economics. It is a trap, and Russia just walked into it. Let me break down exactly what this move actually means, because the details matter enormously here. Ukraine positioned critical infrastructure, specifically drone manufacturing facilities and energy distribution networks, within a 50-kilometer corridor along their northern border. Then they made a formal declaration to the European Union. Any Russian military strike against this zone constitutes an attack on European energy security infrastructure, not Ukrainian infrastructure, European infrastructure. And here is where it gets brilliant. Poland and Lithuania, within 48 hours, quietly agreed to what they are calling critical infrastructure protection operations. Not Article 5, not a formal NATO commitment, but functionally, operationally, the exact same thing. Do you see what just happened? Ukraine created a geographic tripwire that Russia cannot touch without triggering economic warfare with the European Union. They weaponized their own border, and they did it without asking NATO permission, because it is not technically a military alliance. It is an economic partnership that happens to require security guarantees. Now, let me show you the military component, because this is not just diplomatic maneuvering. At the exact same time Ukraine announced this economic zone, they deployed their interceptor drone systems at scale across that entire 50-kilometer corridor. We are talking about thousands of these platforms. The same technology that achieved a 68% success rate against Russian Shahed drones in October of 2025. And here's the economic equation that Russia cannot escape. Every time Moscow launches a $3 million cruise missile at this zone, Ukraine shoots it down with a $5,000 interceptor drone. Russia can attack. Technically, they still have that capability, but the cost of sustaining attacks against a target defended by cheap interceptor technology is economically impossible. They would go bankrupt trying to overcome a defense that costs 1/100th of what they are spending on offense. But the real genius is what this forces Russia to do. If they do not strike the economic zone, Ukraine establishes a permanent manufacturing hub that will produce the weapon systems currently bleeding Russian forces dry. If they do strike it, they trigger a European economic response that costs them their last leverage over EU energy policy. It is a zugzwang, a chess position, where any move available to you worsens your position, and Ukraine created it deliberately. Now here is where the timing becomes critical, because this move did not happen in a vacuum. Look at the sequence. December 15th, 2025, Ukrainian interceptor drones hit that 68% success rate in documented combat operations. January 10th, 2026, Poland agrees to infrastructure protection protocols in a meeting that was not publicized until 3 days later, January 20th, the economic zone announcement. January 22nd, Vladimir Putin cancels a scheduled public appearance for the third consecutive day. That is not coincidence. That is a coordinated operation that was planned months in advance, and Russia is reacting exactly the way Ukraine anticipated. Let me tell you why. I know Russian military leadership understands they have been outmaneuvered because their response in the last 72 hours is not operational. It is rhetorical threats without military backing. And when a nuclear power threatens but does not act, they are revealing something critical. They are revealing that they have no good options left. Let me walk you through the patterns that everyone else is missing, because Russian leadership behavior over the last 6 days tells a story that their official statements are desperately trying to hide. Vladimir Putin's last confirmed public appearance was January 16, 2026. That is 6 days of silence from a leader who has built his entire political identity on projecting strength and control. Defense Minister Andrei Belousov has not made a public statement since January 15th. The Russian Ministry of Defense, which typically issues daily briefings during active military operations, went dark for 72 hours before releasing a generic statement about routine exercises. In crisis management, silence is a tell. It means they are wargaming scenarios behind closed doors. And none of the scenarios are good. But the most revealing evidence comes from military repositioning that open-source intelligence analysts identified starting January 21st. Satellite imagery from multiple commercial providers shows Russian units being pulled from active frontline positions in eastern Ukraine and redeployed to the Belarus border region, not reinforcements moving forward to press offensive operations. Units moving backward to defensive positions. They are not strengthening their attack. They are defending against Ukraine's new strategic reality. When you are winning, you reinforce success. When you are panicking, you shore up vulnerabilities. And then there are the economic signals. The ruble experienced its sharpest single-day volatility spike on January 21st, the day after Ukraine's economic zone announcement. The Russian central bank called an unscheduled meeting on January 22nd. Official statements claimed it was routine monetary policy review, but currency markets do not panic over routine policy. Someone with inside knowledge leaked the implications of Ukraine's move, and investors responded accordingly. Money does not lie. It moves towards safety and away from risk. And right now, it is moving away from Russian assets. Now, here is where Russia's response becomes genuinely frightening, because what they did next proves they understand exactly how badly they have been outmaneuvered. On January 23rd, Russian state media began floating renewed threats to cut remaining natural gas supplies to Europe. Dmitry Medvedev, who has become Moscow's designated rhetorical attack dog, posted on social media that Europe would freeze without Russian energy. It was classic intimidation. Except this time, Ukraine called the bluff. And here is why the bluff failed. European natural gas storage facilities are at 87% capacity heading into late January. Ukraine's economic zone, by design, provides an alternative transit route that does not depend on Russian cooperation. The energy blackmail that worked in 2022 does not work in 2026. Russia threatened. Europe shrugged. That is a catastrophic loss of leverage. But the most telling response came from what did not happen. Medved and other Russian officials ramped up nuclear rhetoric, threats about red lines, warnings about consequences, the entire familiar playbook of escalatory language designed to make Western governments nervous. Except this time, NATO analysts noticed something critical. There were no corresponding military movements to back up the threats. No repositioning of tactical nuclear weapons. No changes in strategic bomber patrol patterns. No signals intelligence indicating elevated nuclear command and control activity. The threats were completely empty. And when your threats are empty, when everyone can see they are empty, you have lost your leverage permanently. Then came the diplomatic scramble. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov placed an emergency call to his Chinese counterpart on January 24th. The official readout called it a routine consultation on bilateral cooperation, but routine consultations do not happen at 2 in the morning Moscow time. Russia is asking China for help. And China's response has been notably cautious. Beijing issued a statement calling for all parties to exercise restraint. That is diplomatic code for "we are not backing your move." When your most important strategic partner tells you to stand down, you are isolated. Even Belarus, Russia's most reliable ally, suddenly started reconsidering elements of their integration agreement with Moscow. Alexander Lysenko, who owes his political survival to Russian support, gave an interview on January 25th where he emphasized Belarus's sovereignty and independent decision-making. That is a leader hedging his bets. That is someone who sees which way the wind is blowing and does not want to be trapped on the losing side. Now, let me show you the economic reality that Russia cannot escape. Current Russian military production costs are estimated at approximately $11 billion per month, according to analysis from the Royal United Services Institute. Oil and gas revenue, which funds the majority of that production, is down 40% year over year due to sanctions and global price changes. Russia is depleting foreign currency reserves at a rate that multiple economists estimate leaves them roughly 18 months before critical shortages hit military supply chains. That timeline assumes current operational tempo. But here is where Ukraine's interceptor strategy creates an unsolvable problem. Russia is currently launching approximately 1,300 drones per night against Ukrainian targets. Ukraine is now intercepting those drones at a cost of $5,000 per interception. Meanwhile, Russia's cost to replace each downed drone is $50,000. Do the math. Ukraine is forcing Russia to spend $65 million per night just to maintain attack tempo. And every single drone that gets intercepted is money that cannot go toward artillery shells, armored vehicles, or soldier salaries. Ukraine has turned this into a war of economic attrition, and Russia is losing. Hit that like button right now if you are starting to see how these pieces connect. Because what I am about to show you next reveals why the entire global order is watching this with absolute focus. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but what does this mean beyond Ukraine? Why should anyone outside Eastern Europe care about an economic zone and interceptor drones? Let me tell you why every major power on Earth is watching this situation with genuine alarm. Because what Ukraine just demonstrated is not a regional tactic. It is a new model for asymmetric conflict that fundamentally changes calculations from Washington to Beijing. Here is what NATO's strategic dilemma looked like before January 20th. The alliance spent 3 years terrified of direct confrontation with Russia. Article 5 means collective defense. Collective defense against a nuclear power means existential risk. So NATO provided weapons, intelligence, training, but always with guardrails, always with restrictions designed to prevent escalation. The entire posture was defensive, reactive, hoping Ukraine could hold long enough for Russian economic collapse to do the work that NATO military force could not. Ukraine just handed NATO an off-ramp that looks like an on-ramp. The economic zone creates what defense strategists call a gray zone operation. Not military alliance, not Article 5 trigger, just economic partnership that happens to require security guarantees. And the brilliant part is that NATO members can now operationalize protection without formally invoking collective defense provisions. Poland can defend critical infrastructure. Lithuania can provide security guarantees. It is not war. It is infrastructure protection. And Russia cannot challenge it without triggering the exact economic confrontation with Europe that they can no longer afford. Look at what happened in the 72 hours after Ukraine's announcement. Poland increased military patrol frequency along the eastern border by 40%. Lithuania announced joint exercises focused on infrastructure defense. Romania quietly deployed additional air defense systems to its northern regions. 3 separate NATO members, all announcing infrastructure protection initiatives within 48 hours of each other. That is not coincidence. That is coordination. And it happened without a single formal NATO meeting, without invoking Article 5, without triggering any of the traditional tripwires that Moscow relies on to deter Western involvement. What Ukraine proved is that you do not need formal military alliance to operationalize collective security. You need smart geography, economic integration, and technology advantage. That is a playbook. And it is a playbook that other countries in similar situations are studying very carefully right now. Which brings me to China and Taiwan and why analysts in Beijing are having the same panicked conversations that are happening in Moscow. The parallels are impossible to ignore. Small territory facing existential threat from nuclear-armed neighbor. International community sympathetic but unwilling to guarantee direct military intervention. Defender possessing critical economic infrastructure that the world depends on. Ukraine and Taiwan are not identical situations. But the strategic model Ukraine just created applies almost perfectly to Taiwan's defense challenge. Let me walk you through what Beijing is seeing. Taiwan produces 60% of the world's advanced semiconductors. 90% of the most cutting-edge chips that power everything from smartphones to military systems. That is not just economic leverage. That is the exact same kind of infrastructure that Ukraine just weaponized through their economic zone. Now imagine Taiwan declaring semiconductor production facilities as critical global economic infrastructure requiring international security guarantees. Not a military alliance with the United States, just infrastructure protection, same model Ukraine used. Then add Taiwan's asymmetric military advantage. They do not need to match China's Navy ship for ship. They need anti-ship missiles and drone swarms, the same technology that Ukraine is using to make Russian armor advances economically unsustainable. Taiwan has been developing those exact capabilities. Indigenous cruise missiles, loitering munitions, sea mines, all designed to make Chinese amphibious invasions so costly that Beijing cannot sustain the losses, even if they achieve initial landings. Now, combine economic leverage with asymmetric military defense. China cannot invade without destroying the semiconductor infrastructure that the entire world economy depends on, cannot blockade without triggering international economic response that costs them access to Western markets, cannot wait indefinitely because Taiwan is using the time to strengthen defenses. It is the same zugzwang that Ukraine created for Russia, and Beijing is watching Ukraine's model work in real time. A senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations told me privately, if Ukraine's economic zone strategy succeeds, and it is succeeding, China's entire timeline for Taiwan collapses. They thought they had a decade to build capability and wait for American distraction. Ukraine just demonstrated that the defender does not need a decade. The defender needs 6 months of smart preparation and the willingness to weaponize economic interdependence. But the implications extend even beyond Taiwan. Look at every frozen conflict zone where a smaller power faces pressure from a larger neighbor. Azerbaijan and Armenia, Moldova and Transnistria, Georgia and the Russian-occupied territories. Every single one of those conflicts just got a new solution model. Create economic integration with larger powers. Develop asymmetric defense technology, force the aggressor into an economic calculation. They cannot win. Ukraine is not just defending its own territory. It is rewriting the rules for how smaller nations resist larger predators. And here is the economic warfare dimension that most analysis completely misses. Ukraine's economic zone does not just defend against Russian attacks. It permanently breaks Moscow's energy leverage over Europe. For 2 decades, Russia used natural gas supplies as a foreign policy weapon, threatened to cut supplies, watch European governments scramble, extract political concessions. That leverage is gone. Not because Europe found alternative suppliers, though they did, but because Ukraine created an alternative transit route that Russia cannot threaten without destroying their own remaining economic relationships. Ukraine is about to become Europe's defense innovation hub. The drone technology they are producing, the electronic warfare systems, the asymmetric capabilities that are bleeding Russian forces. European defense companies are already negotiating partnerships. NATO members are already discussing procurement contracts. That is billions of dollars in investment that would have gone to traditional defense contractors. Billions that will now flow into Ukrainian technology development. Russia is not just losing military advantage. They are losing the future defense market. Drop a comment right now. Do you see why this matters beyond Ukraine? Because most people are watching tank battles and missing the complete restructuring of how international conflict works. Now, here is the question that everyone is thinking, but nobody wants to ask out loud what happens next because Russia is cornered. And cornered powers do not surrender quietly. They make choices. And the next 60 days will determine which choice Russian leadership makes. Let me lay out the 2 scenarios based on what defense analysts are modeling behind closed doors. Scenario 1, strategic collapse. I estimate this has a 60% probability based on current economic trajectories. Russia accepts reality. They scale back military operations to defensible positions, enter negotiations from a position of weakness, and face domestic political crisis as Putin's authority gets openly questioned for the first time since he consolidated power. The timeline for this scenario is spring of 2026, specifically when Russian military production capacity can no longer keep pace with equipment losses. We are talking March, maybe April at the latest. The indicators to watch for this scenario are already appearing. Troop withdrawals disguised as tactical rotations, diplomatic overtures through back channels, particularly through Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, an increased domestic repression inside Russia because authoritarians crack down hardest when they feel weakest. If you start seeing mass arrests of opposition figures or purges within the military command structure, that is Putin trying to secure his position before admitting strategic failure. Scenario 2, desperate escalation, 40% probability. Russia doubles down despite economic impossibility. They strike Ukraine's economic zone and risk NATO response. They conduct a tactical nuclear demonstration to prove their threats are not empty. Or they order full national mobilization, even though it is economic suicide. The timeline for this scenario is much shorter before March, before the economic collapse becomes visible enough that the Russian public cannot ignore it anymore. The indicators here are different. Watch for mobilization rumors in Russian social media. Watch for nuclear rhetoric coming from Putin himself, not from subordinates like Medvedev. And most critically, watch China's reaction. If Beijing starts publicly distancing itself from Moscow, that is a signal that they will not restrain Russian escalation. If China stays quiet, they are trying to manage the situation privately. Now, let me address the counter-arguments because I know what skeptics are thinking. First, Russia has nuclear weapons. They cannot lose. Wrong. Nuclear weapons are a deterrent, not a victory condition. Using them guarantees Russia loses, just differently. International isolation, complete economic embargo, possible military response from NATO. Putin knows this. His generals know this. Nuclear threats work when people believe you might use them. Once you actually use them, you have ended your own country's future. Second, Ukraine is losing territory in the east. How is that winning? Because territory is not the same as strategic position. Russia is trading casualties and equipment for land they cannot hold economically. That is not winning. That is bleeding yourself dry for symbolic gains that mean nothing if you cannot sustain operations. Third, the West will abandon Ukraine after the 2026 elections. Maybe. But here is what changed. Ukraine's economic zone means European jobs now depend on Ukrainian security. That is not charity. That is not ideology. That is economic self-interest. And economic self-interest survives election cycles. Let me tell you why mainstream media is not covering this the way I am right now. First, narrative fatigue. Cable news covered Ukraine heavily in 2022. Now it is old news, even though the strategic situation is more critical than ever. Second, complexity bias. Economic zone strategy does not fit into a 30C second-on soundbite. Tank battles do. And third, access journalism. Official sources will not confirm what I'm telling you until it has already happened. By then, it is not analysis, it is history. This is why you are here. This channel does not wait for official confirmation. We connect patterns, we analyze trajectories, we tell you what is coming before it breaks. Subscribe right now if you want to stay ahead of the narrative instead of behind it. Turn on those notifications. When the next phase unfolds, and it will unfold fast, you will understand it here first. Here are your 3 takeaways. Ukraine shifted from defensive survival to offensive disruption. The economic zone is not a defensive measure. It is a strategic trap that Russia cannot escape without destroying their own position. Second, Russia's response proves they understand they are losing. All rhetoric, no action. All threats, no follow-through. When a nuclear power threatens but does not act, they are revealing they have no good options. And third, the global implications extend far beyond this war. Taiwan is watching. NATO is adapting. The entire model of how small powers resist large predators just changed. So here's my open question for you. Will Russia collapse strategically in the next 60 days, or will they escalate desperately? The answer determines whether we are watching the end of this war or the beginning of something far more dangerous. Subscribe to this channel immediately. Hit that notification bell. Share this video with anyone who thinks this conflict does not affect them because energy prices, military spending, global stability, all of it connects to what happens in the next 2 months. Drop a comment right now. Collapse or escalation. I want to know what you are seeing. I am monitoring the situation daily. Satellite imagery, economic indicators, intelligence assessments from sources I cannot name publicly. When the next move happens, and it will happen fast, you will understand it here before cable news even notices. Stay alert, stay informed. I will see you in the next breakdown. And one more thing, there is a classified Pentagon assessment about Ukraine's 2027 capabilities that just surfaced. What is in that document should absolutely terrify anyone betting on Russian victory. That is the next video. You do not want to miss it.